Good afternoon, everyone, and a very happy Thursday to you all, no matter where you're joining us from. If you're joining us from here in the UK, if you're joining us internationally, you are most welcome, and thank you so much for joining us for another Thursday lecture. As you will see, I am in a different location today. This is the very first time I've been able to do a lecture from inside one of our churches, and thanks to the joys of technology, everything, touch wood, is working fine just at the moment. Sadly, Peter Ayres can't join us today. So Church of the Week is where normally Peter or someone else talks about a particular church in our care at the Trust, which has a connection in some way to today's topic. However, very sadly, earlier this year, our chairman, Peter Ainsworth, sadly died rather suddenly. And today his memorial is being held, his memorial service is being held at St. Margaret's Church in Westminster. And our chief executive has gone to that today. So it falls to me today to do Church Week. So what I'm doing is I'm going to give you behind the scenes tour of one of our churches. Now, I'm at the Church of St. Nicholas in Withernsea, which is not far from Hull. And this is one of our most recent investments. This came to us in 2019. We've been doing conservation work, investing repairs here, and those repairs are coming to completion shortly. We've got a few more weeks' work, but I thought while I'm here, I might as well do the lecture here. So bear with me, because I'm going to jump on to a secondary camera, which I can walk around with, and we are going to do a tour. So bear with me. There we go, everyone. So hopefully this should be working fine. I'm just going to grab my little notes. So just get framed. So we are inside the Church of St. Nicholas, Withernsea. And I don't know if you can hear me. You can hear me, I've been told. Yes, you can hear me. So we're inside St. Nicholas's Church in Withernsea. Now, this church is not particularly old, although the original fabric dates from 1488. However, it was rebuilt in the 16th century. Now, Withernsea is a seaside town. As I said, we're not that far from Hull. Now, there used to be a couple of other churches, but they've been lost to the sea. So in similar places like Dunwich in Suffolk, used to have quite a few churches. Withernsea was the same. And this church that we're in now, St. Nicholas's, actually in the 16th century was in quite a bad state of repair. It was roofless, the tower had collapsed. But as a result of losing the other church, they decided to do a lot of restoration and conservation work here. So what they did is when they rebuilt the north and south aisles, they rebuilt the porch on the north side of the church, but they used a lot of that earlier fabric. Now, I'm going to take you outside. I'm going to show you some of the work. But it's been a major project. As I said, this church came to us in 2019, and the repairs were hit quite badly. Our times slipped because of the impact of COVID-19, but the work that's been going on here has been fantastic. So I'm going to take you down to the bottom of the churchyard so you get a really great view of the church, but you'll see there's scaffolding up, we've got workmen here, and one of the great joys about this particular project is seeing the amount of local craftspeople involved not only in sort of conserving this church, but in also in keeping heritage skills alive here. Now, I'm going to, hopefully, you can see just behind me, we've got the chancel, we've got the tower, and it is glorious. Now, we've done quite a lot of work on the stonework here, so particularly the roofs need a lot of care and attention. Now, we say quite often, one of the most important things that we need to do in terms of church conservation is just to keep water out of the building. So that's why we've had to do roof repairs. We've put a new guttering in quite a lot of places. But one of the challenges we found here is that the soil is very, very clayey. And when we did some excavation, we found that the drain pipes which go into the soil, they didn't have drainage pipes that took the water away from the churchyard. So it was causing damp, it was causing other issues as well. So it's been great. We've had to do quite a lot of work on the cordon sanitaire, which is really important in getting water away from the building. But I'm going to take you over to a little grave that I discovered earlier, because Withernsea during the Second World War had a hospital. And it's quite important that I've learned from a local councillor and poet actually early on about a story that during the Second World War, a German plane flying over crashed, and this 16 boys, what some of them were choristers here at St. Nicholas, went to the wreckage of that plane and they tried to salvage ammunition, and they got big guns, they got the cannon from the plane, and they took the ammo and they brought it back to the church. They had keys to the church and they put it on the top of this tower. And the idea of what they wanted to do was basically to make St. Nicholas a fortress, so that if any enemy aircraft came over, these choristers were going to go up and shoot down the German planes. Now, I'm pleased to say that never happened, because a bit of ammunition fell off one of those boys' wardrobes, and his father found out. And let's just say his father hit the roof and put a stop to it. But as I said, there was an important hospital here, and buried in our churchyard here, you can just see down here, this is the grave of Florence Cavell. Now, this is Edith Cavell's sister. She was matron at the hospital, and when she died, I'm just going to read you here what it says here. It was the Hull and East. It was the Hull and East Riding Hospital for convalescence home, and particularly people from the war. But she died in June in 1960. But it was a really quite a nice thing to discover, and I didn't know that connection, because obviously Edith Cavell, everyone's heard about her involvement in the war, but it's really quite nice to find that her sister is buried in one of our churches. Now, I said there's there's still a bit more work to be done at the church. They're doing some more plastering work here, but I'm going to quickly take you in and show you 2 stained glass windows before we get on with today's lecture. So let me just walk you back in. I can't see any comments, I'm afraid, at the moment, but when I go back in, I'll be able to see comments coming in. But I'm just going to walk you in, just excuse some of the noise. So we're now back in the church. Now, what I might do is just get someone to hold, because I need to read my notes here, because there's some really beautiful stained glass. I'm going to bring it here. So we're in the north aisle here at the moment. And let me get my map. Hopefully you can just see this window behind me. And I'm just going to, there you go. So hopefully you can hear this, everyone. Now, this window above me dates. It was created, sorry, let me get this right. I need to get the right date here. This was created by Harry James Stammers in the late 1940s. And what you can see here is really quite beautiful. So there's that very famous saying that Jesus says, let he who's without sin cast the first stone. And that's what we've got here. So we've got Jesus in here, in the center, and we've got the woman, and we've got the other Jewish leaders at the sides there, the priests who were, asking Jesus, to punish this woman, and Jesus intervenes, and he just goes, says there, go and sin no more. So that very famous passage from scripture. It's rather beautiful, actually. When I first saw it, I thought it might have been common, but it's not. As I said, it's by Harry Stammers. Now, in the other side, so now we're going into the, sorry, that was the south aisle, not north. Now we're in the north aisle. We've got this beautiful scene of the crucifixion. Now, I'm going to see if I can get you a bit closer, because if you look, and I'll show you in a minute, if you look behind the crucifixion of Christ, you'll see a depiction of the Holy City. Now, what's quite interesting is that this depiction of the Holy City is very stylized. It's very Gothic and very medieval, because obviously 2,000 years ago, when Jesus was crucified in Jerusalem, Jerusalem would not have looked in the way it looks in this depiction. But have a look at it, because I think it's a really beautiful stained glass window. But hopefully you can see just how beautiful this is. So obviously we've got Mary and John the Beloved on the side there. Now, I'm going to be here for the rest of the day. We're doing some filming today, and I'm going to be back here tomorrow. And I'm pleased to say that our Chief Executive, Peter Reyes, will be joining us here tomorrow. So we're going to do a live stream tomorrow. So I hope that you can all join us for that, but I'll let everyone know when we're doing that. But I'm just going to get my friend Clara Martin. Can I just pass this to you? And what I'm going to do is I'm going to quickly hop back on and introduce today's guest lecturer. But thank you ever so much, everyone, and I'll see you shortly on my laptop. Brilliant. Thank you ever so much, everyone. So I hope that worked. I'm getting nods from a couple of people. I've had some messages coming in. So that's really great that that worked. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to pass you over to Dr. Francis Young, who's joining us once again to do a lunchtime lecture for us. He did a couple for us last year, so we're really grateful to Dr. Francis Young for joining us. So without any further delay, over to you, Francis.
Thank you very much, George. I'm just going to share my screen now, so you should be all able to see it. Right, hopefully you can all see that. It's great to be back speaking at one of these wonderful lunchtime lectures. And today's theme is a history of the English exorcism. Now, I have written a couple of books on the subject of the history of exorcism, and you can see them on the screen here. In 2016, I brought out a book called A History of Exorcism in Catholic Christianity, which really is a survey of the entire history of exorcism in the Latin West, beginning in about 400 AD and going right through to the present day, but with a particular focus on the Roman Catholic Church. And so in order to supplement that, in 2018, I brought out a second book, A History of Anglican Exorcism, which focused particularly on the history of exorcism in the Church of England, going from the Reformation down to the present day. Now, today I'm going to mix in a little bit of both of the themes of these two books, but mainly the focus is on England, and therefore we will be talking about the history of exorcism as it is practiced within the Church of England, as it has historically been practiced in England in the Middle Ages before that. But before we begin, let's take a little look at what we actually mean by exorcism, because people sometimes mean something slightly different compared to what they're thinking of. First of all, if we look at the Greek root of this word, exorcisto, it simply means to swear by oath. So in ancient Greece, if you were taking a solemn oath in a court of law or something like that, you might have used this term, exorcisto, from the Greek word orkos, meaning an oath. But it also acquires this religious significance, and that's a significance that goes all the way back to ancient Mesopotamia. In some of the earliest written texts of humanity, we've got exorcisms, we've got commands to spirits to depart, which invoke the power of a god in order to expel a spirit in some way. And that root meaning of the word is less about the expulsion of the unwanted spirit and more about the taking of the oath in the name of a god. So it's calling upon the power of some divine being in order to achieve some specific purpose. Now, when we tend to think of exorcism, perhaps foremost in our minds in modern popular culture is the film The Exorcist, which came out in 1974. And that really involves this very dramatic confrontation between a priest exorcist and a demon that's possessing the body of a young girl. And so our idea of exorcism is very much formed by this, but it can mean a lot more than that. First of all, exorcism doesn't have to be the attempt to expel a spirit from the body of someone who is apparently possessed. It can be a much more general process of ridding an area of spiritual evil. And of course, sometimes exorcism is spoken of in terms of haunted houses, of somebody going in and trying to rid a house of a ghost or a spirit or something like that. So already there you've got two quite different meanings of exorcism in that sense. But as we go through today's talk, hopefully you'll gain a clearer idea of how different people's ideas of exorcism have sometimes been. And this has been a very controversial issue in English religious history, certainly. But let's go back to the earliest ideas of exorcism that we find in England. And in Old English, the word that means exorcism is hausung. And this is an entirely Germanic word. There's no borrowing here from Latin or Greek. And that hausung is originally, it has the connotations of a confrontation between a hero and some kind of monster, some kind of supernatural being. And the most famous of Old English poems, Beowulf, you could argue, and it has been argued by some Old English scholars, that the book is essentially about exorcism as understood by pre-Christian Old English people. So, for example, we have the confrontation between Beowulf and the dragon. The dragon, if you remember in Beowulf, is protecting treasure. So the dragon is a treasure spirit. And in fact, we find that throughout English magic, going down through the centuries, there is this interest in using exorcism as a way of driving away spirits that are protecting treasure. And this is a belief that goes right down to the early modern period. You still find it in the 18th century, that buried treasure will be protected by malevolent spirits. And therefore, you've got to have an exorcism before you go there. You need to be skilled in magic if you want to hunt for buried treasure. Or indeed, the monster Grendel. We have a confrontation between Beowulf and this monster who is causing a great deal of annoyance and slaying warriors at the Hall of Heorot. So again, you could argue this is a primitive idea of exorcism. It's not a spiritualized idea of exorcism. It's literally the hero going out there and killing monsters. But certainly when you compare that with some early Anglo-Saxon Christian texts, such as the life of St. Guthlac, a hermit saint who goes to live on a remote island in the middle of the fens in Lincolnshire, he has this confrontation with demons. And it isn't that much different from Beowulf's confrontation with Grendel. These are demons who just crawl out of the mere, just like Grendel does, and have to be dispatched by the holy man, or indeed the life of St. Botolph, another great Anglo-Saxon saint. So this idea of the Halcyon, the confrontation with the evil being, it passes straight into the Anglo-Saxon Christian tradition. And Anglo-Saxon Christianity is very much a composite of Roman Christianity, but also the native ideas of the Anglo-Saxon people. But one of the things that we notice when we look at the medieval and the Anglo-Saxon experience of exorcism is that it was very much focused around something you'll find in every church, and that is the font. This one is the font at St. Austell in Cornwall. And you'll notice that it's got dragons on it. And in fact, quite a lot of early fonts have got dragons and mythical beasts and quite scary looking beings on them. And this is a reminder that a key part of the ritual of baptism was exorcism. When you go back to the early Roman church, sometimes the catechumens, those who were coming forward for baptism, in the early church, of course, those were adults rather than infants, would go through 7 days of exorcisms where the deacons of Rome would harangue them with sermons and perform exorcisms over them in order to ensure that the devil was completely gone before they went through the ritual of baptism itself. Now, by the Middle Ages, this has become much more truncated, but it's nevertheless pretty explicit. You get this orders to Satan to depart from the body of the child. And it's difficult to know exactly how literally people took this in the Middle Ages. It's fairly full-blooded language. And there's some evidence that people were very anxious that their children might die before baptism. Not so much because they'd miss out on the baptism, but also perhaps because they'd miss out on the chance of exorcism. And if they missed out on the exorcism, then the child would, in a sense, belong to Satan. Now, the extent to which people believe that is debatable, but certainly there's some evidence that you've got there in folklore. For example, there's long-standing belief in folklore that you need to leave the north door of the church open next to the font so that Satan can escape from the child being baptized and go out of that door. So yeah, the liturgy of baptism is very much bound up with exorcism. So that's one way in which medieval people would have encountered exorcism on a daily basis, because children were being baptized all the time. Another area that they would have encountered it is something that I would describe as spiritual pest control. If you have an infestation of insects in your crops, if your sheep or your cattle were ill with some kind of disease, if you were suffering from toothache, then you might go to the priest and you might ask for an exorcism. And that, I think, is an idea that's quite unfamiliar with us. We tend to think of exorcism as a pretty extreme measure. It's something which only happens when the devil shows up. But for medieval people, it was something that happened when disease showed up. And that's because they believed a lot of the time that diseases and minor pestilences were caused by demons. For example, the belief that toothache was caused by demons living in your teeth, sort of minor demons causing you trouble. And so that's another way in which we will find a lot of exorcisms. However, one of the interesting features of England in the Middle Ages is that exorcism, in the way that we might first think of it, the idea of clerical priestly exorcisms, of energumens, which is the technical term for people who believe themselves to be possessed by devils, these are not something that really happens in medieval England. And in fact, we have a story in the life of St. Cuthbert, where Cuthbert has just died, and at that time a boy thinks that he's possessed, and he goes to a local priest, this is in the late 7th century, and says, please, can you perform the rite of exorcism on me? And in fact, that priest would have had access to the rite of exorcism because it was contained within the ritual being part of a larger book called the Pontifical. The Pontifical was a massive compendium of ceremonies that a bishop might be called upon to perform. And so a priest would normally have a slightly shorter version of that book called the Ritual, or Rituale in Latin. And normally a priest would have the rituale and he'd have a missal, the missal being the book that tells you how to say the mass, the rituale being the book that contains other rites, for example, the rite of baptism, the rite of burying the dead and so forth, all the stuff that a priest would need on a daily basis. But it also contains the rite for the exorcism of energumens. But it doesn't work. So the priest is unsuccessful in exorcising the boy, but then it just so happens that the body of St. Cuthbert has just been washed by the monks. And the boy asks, you know, can I drink some of this water that's been used to wash the body of the saint? And the monks say yes, and the boy is instantly cured. And this is a cautionary tale, really, that exorcism that merely relies upon the power of the priest is just not good enough in English religious culture. If you really want to be exorcised, if you want to be free from the devil, you need to go to a saint. You need to go to the shrine. You need to touch the body of a saint. And so English exorcism, the medieval tradition of English exorcism, is what I would describe as charismatic exorcism, focused on shrines, focused on the bodies of saints. And there are a number of different exorcist saints in English tradition. So two of the most famous ones, who are exorcist saints in the sense that they themselves were famous as exorcists. On one side, we've got St. Dunstan, and then we've also got a pilgrim badge here of Sir John Sean. Now, St. Dunstan, very well-known medieval saint. He was probably the most popular English saint among English people in the early part of the Middle Ages in England, only replaced by Thomas Becket when he comes along as a saint at the end of the 12th century. And Dunstan is famous for a rather amusing story about how when he was a young man and he was a blacksmith, the devil turned up and tried to tempt him. And it just so happened that Dunstan, because he was an apprentice blacksmith, has this pair of red hot tongs, and he pinches the devil on the nose to show his contempt for Satan. And this becomes a very famous story of Dunstan. But of course here, Dunstan is represented in pontifical robes because he later becomes Abbot of Glastonbury, and eventually he becomes Archbishop of Canterbury. This is in the 10th century. So that, in a sense, is a form of exorcism because he banishes the devil by pinching him on the nose. So this idea that, you know, a really powerful saint, a truly holy man, will show total contempt for the devil and send him packing like Dunstan did. And then we've also got Sir John Sean. Now, he's an interesting character because he's not an official saint. He's not somebody who was ever universally recognized by the church as canonized. But he was the rector of North Marston in Buckinghamshire in the 13th century, and he was famous for his learning. He's often portrayed on late medieval rood screen dados. I'm sure there must be one or two churches in the care of the Churches Conservation Trust that have got an image of Sir John Sean, but he's quite popular, particularly in East Anglia. And he's often portrayed as a doctor, so wearing doctor's academical robes and sometimes wearing a pair of spectacles, and holding a boot, and out of the boot is popping a little devil. Again, almost a comical image. And some scholars have argued in the 19th century that the children's toy, the Jack-in-the-Box, was actually derived from this image because you had people making little replicas of Sir John Sean's boot with a little devil that would pop out to scare the children. So again, it's because John Sean was said to have confined the devil in a boot. And that's a theme that we'll come back to a little bit later when we look at exorcism in English folklore. Now, interestingly enough, neither of these saints, although they were famous as exorcists in their stories, they're not really saints that we have much evidence that people prayed to in order to be free from demonic influence. And instead, the saint that people would pray to most often is perhaps a rather surprising one. And again, it's somebody who was never an official saint. And this is King Henry VI. Now, King Henry VI, as I'm sure you'll be aware, was king in the 15th century. He's the son of Henry V, comes to the throne at a very young age in 1422, when Henry V dies, leaving the infant Henry VI under the care of his uncles. The uncles rule over England and France, because Henry is also king of France at this stage. And the jealousy between the uncles and different branches of the royal family ultimately leads to the Wars of the Roses. And unfortunately, Henry VI does not have the capacity mentally to unite the country. He is not really an effective king. He suffers from some kind of condition. We don't know exactly what it was. It's been interpreted as mental illness. It's been interpreted as some kind of mental disability. We just don't know exactly what was wrong, but something was clearly up with Henry VI that made him incapable of ruling. And as a result, his wife, Margaret of Anjou, ends up taking over. She's unpopular, and eventually you get his overthrow by Richard of York and his son, Edward IV. Henry VI then comes back for a brief period and then is finally incarcerated in the Tower and killed. So he is venerated as a martyr, particularly by the successors of his Lancastrian dynasty, the Tudors. So when Henry VII becomes king, after the Battle of Bosworth in 1485, he aggressively promotes the cult of Henry VI and tries to get the Pope to turn Henry VI into a saint. And it's not successful, but in England, Henry VI is nevertheless much venerated. And the place where he is much venerated is in fact the place on the right here, which is St. George's Chapel, Windsor. Now today, St. George's Chapel, Windsor is somewhere that's renowned for royal events, and we would probably think of it as a very sedate place. But go back to the 16th century, St. George's Chapel, Windsor would have been packed with people who believed themselves to be possessed by the devil, because they've all turned up at the tomb of Henry VI, desperate to be freed from demonic possession. And the reason for this seems to be that people thought that Henry VI himself was also oppressed by the devil, and it was because of that that he was incapable of being the effective king that he needed to be. But nevertheless, he gained this extraordinary reputation for holiness. And the other place that people went on the left here, which is also still there, is the Church of St. Bartholomew the Great, absolutely wonderful church in central London, which originally was the church attached to the hospital of St. Bartholomew. Now, St. Bartholomew's Hospital is there today still, but of course it's now a huge modern hospital. But in the Middle Ages, it was a place where people would go in the hope that they might be able to go to sleep near to the relics of St. Bartholomew in the church. And during that sleep, St. Bartholomew would visit them in a dream and might cure them. And this is something that goes right the way back to the ancient world. It's called incubation, the belief that a god or a saint might visit you in a dream and cure you while you're sleeping. And so St. Bartholomew's Hospital was also very much associated with deliverance from demonic oppression, and people would turn up there believing they were possessed. Another one was St. Fride's in Oxford, Christ Church Cathedral, Oxford. That shrine is still there today, although interestingly enough, neither of these three places tends to be frequented by people who believe themselves to be demonically possessed today. Fashions have changed and moved on. So as I mentioned, exorcism in the way that we might think of it, the idea of a priest performing some kind of powerful ritual of words over somebody who believes themselves to be possessed, is simply not something that happens in the Middle Ages in England. There is just no evidence that it ever happened, apart from that one story about it not working in the life of St. Cuthbert. The only words of power that a priest was going to be pronouncing would be in the liturgy of baptism, or if the priest was called upon to perform some kind of minor exorcism of your crops or your cattle or whatever. But then along comes the Reformation. Well, one of the things that the Reformation does is that it removes the words of exorcism from baptism, eventually. They're contained in the 1549 prayer book, which is Edward VI's first prayer book in English. So the first one of those simplified Protestant liturgies retains that prayer of exorcism. But by 1552, Edward's second prayer book, it's gone. Exorcism comes back under Mary Tudor, but it's gone again in the 1559 prayer book under Elizabeth I, where it reverts to that 1552 version where there's no baptism, there's no exorcism in baptism. And so what role does exorcism have? Well, a number of the people who are leading figures in the Elizabethan church, this is in the 1560s, have been living in various cities around Europe during the reign of Elizabeth's half-sister Mary Tudor. If they hadn't gone to the continent, then they would have been burnt at the stake for heresy. So they've been to Zurich, they've been to Geneva, they've been to Frankfurt, they've been to Augsburg, all of these great Protestant cities of the continent in Switzerland and in Germany. And one of the things that they learned there was that exorcism was being practiced in some of those Protestant communities. And this was out of a belief among some Protestants that the end of the world was nigh. The Reformation was a sign that the Antichrist was gaining power in the form of the Pope. Jesus was surely going to return quite soon, and therefore the devil was out and about, active and alive in the world in a way that the devil had not been for many, many centuries. And therefore exorcism was needed more than ever. So that's one particular Protestant view. And in Chester in 1564, we have this new worldview suddenly exploding in the Church of England. We have a couple of prebendaries of Chester Cathedral who decide that a local girl called Anne Milner in 1564 has become possessed. Now, a very sketchy account is given of exactly how she became possessed. She was just walking along the road between her home village and the city of Chester and met the devil and became possessed in some way. Very little clear account is given of this. But these two prebendaries decide that they're going to attempt an exorcism, and so they essentially make it up as they go along. The old exorcisms are out of the window because they're in Latin. They are an inheritance of the old popish church, no longer acceptable in the Protestant Church of England. So these two prebendaries busk it and see what they can do, and they are apparently successful. And it really passes without much controversy. There's a pamphlet advertising that this has happened, but it is really taken as proof of, the holiness of the new Protestant Church of England, that it's able to cast out devils. All well and good. But this does not last long. We soon get to a point where there's quite a lot of controversy happening around these early exorcisms. Another person who performs an early exorcism is John Foxe, one of the best known figures in that early Elizabethan church. John Foxe is famous for a book that he wrote, The Acts and Monuments, which is this enormous account of all the sufferings of Protestants who were burnt for heresy during Mary Tudor's reign, but also other people that John Foxe considered to be martyrs for the Protestant cause going way back, and indeed into the early church. But it's this huge denunciation of Catholicism as a corrupt form of Christianity and the Pope as the Antichrist and so forth, which became immensely popular. And in fact, there were instructions that this book, along with the Bible, should be chained to the pulpit of every parish church in England at one stage. So it's one of the most read books in the Church of England in the early modern period. But John Foxe was also an exorcist. He had also spent time abroad, and he had encountered these new practices of exorcism, and he decided one day that he would try it out at the Temple Church in London. And one of the things that he does when exorcising is that he commands the spirit to leave the body of the possessed person. Now, that might seem to make a great deal of sense when you look at the biblical material, because this is in fact what the apostles do. The apostles, in the Acts of the Apostles, command evil spirits to leave the body of people in the name of Jesus. In the Gospels, of course, it doesn't happen like that, because Jesus himself is performing the exorcism, and Jesus doesn't need to tell demons to leave somebody's body in his own name. He will simply command because of his divine status. But certainly the Acts of the Apostles, we have this idea of exorcism. But this becomes controversial because one of the debates within the Protestant community at this time is the extent to which the renewed gospel church, the Protestant church, can be compared to the Church of the Apostles. Well, in one way it can be compared, because the Protestants believe that they're recovering this kind of primitive gospel truth that the Catholic Church has been obscuring. But in other ways, they think it's not the same. So, for example, Calvin in Geneva, Zwingli in Zurich, they argue that the age of miracles has ceased. And this is what's known in theology as cessationism. If miracles have ceased, that means that it is no longer possible for the preachers of the gospel to go out and heal people in the name of Jesus, because for God's own reasons, he has withdrawn that kind of power. And part of the reason for cessationism was to make fun of the Catholic Church for claiming that it could perform miracles on a daily basis. The Catholic claim that transubstantiation in the Mass is a miracle. The Catholic claim that relics and saints could perform miracles and things like that. So it's a way in which the Protestants could criticize the Catholic Church. And so some Protestants go cessationist. They say there are no miracles and also no exorcisms, because that is also an exercise of God's power here and now in the world in a way that is miraculous to free someone from oppression by Satan. And so Protestants are divided on this, and some criticize Foxe and they say, you shouldn't have done that. You shouldn't have used those words of power. You're pretending to be the apostles. You're not an apostle. You're just, a preacher of the word of God. So you don't have that kind of power to do that. And others said, well, no, it is okay. You can do that. These things are possible in the present dispensation. And we have a huge debate that springs up around one particular exorcist. And it's not Foxe, in fact. It's another man who's originally much more obscure than Foxe, called John Darrell, who's from Mansfield in Nottinghamshire. And John Darrell begins a campaign of exorcism in 1584, around the same time that Fox is performing his exorcisms. But Darrell takes a slightly different route, and he decides that instead of what's known as adjuration, where you address the spirit and you say, depart in the name of Jesus, or I cast you out in the name of Jesus, or something along those lines. Instead, what Darrell does is he will gather a whole load of godly people, mostly Protestants of the more Puritan disposition within the Church of England, around the person who they believe is possessed. And then Darrell will preach. He will preach for hours and hours and hours. The whole group will pray for hours and hours. They will fast for days and days. And this goes back to Jesus's remark at one point in the Gospels where he says, this kind of spirit can be cast out only with prayer and fasting. And there were some Protestants who take this kind of middle position. So they say, well, we don't believe in adjuration. We don't believe in doing things in the Catholic way. We don't believe in using these, adjurations, direct addresses to the spirit. But we do think that people do still become possessed by the devil. And we do think that we can free them. But the way we free them is we just ask God. We pray to God day in, day out. We fast. They don't call them exorcisms. They call them dispossessions. So in other words, you are not commanding the spirit to depart, but you are doing all that you can that is permissible within this Protestant worldview in order to free someone from the influence of an evil spirit. And it causes a great deal of controversy. One person who is dead set against the idea of exorcisms is Matthew Parker, Queen Elizabeth's first Archbishop of Canterbury. And in fact, none of Elizabeth's Archbishops of Canterbury were particularly keen, with the possible exception of Edmund Grindal, who's Parker's successor. But Parker is somebody who frowns upon fellow bishops issuing licenses for public days of prayer and fasting for the casting out of evil spirits, which some bishops did do. The Bishop of Norwich at one stage orders a public fast in order to free somebody from demonic possession. But Archbishop Parker is having none of that. And that's because he's adopting that more cessationist position, that this is not something which we should expect to be happening in the present church. And part of that goes back to a Swiss reformer called Benedict Marty. And Marty says, well, if you actually look at the Gospels, Jesus doesn't use a formula of adjuration. He doesn't address the spirits in the name of God to depart, because he himself is Jesus. He himself is God. So in other words, it's something which is best left to Jesus himself. It's not something which the ministers of the gospel can take upon themselves now. And in fact, a later Archbishop of Canterbury brings Darrell to trial for this. But to complicate matters further, there's other stuff that is going on at this time. What happens in Elizabeth's reign is that Catholic clergy who have been trained abroad on the continent in exile, much like their Protestant counterparts in Mary's reign, have decided that they're going to return to England to try and bring England back to the Catholic faith. And most prominent among those are the Jesuits. The most prominent Jesuit exorcist who came to England was William Weston. And this is a portrait of William Weston that's in the English College in Valladolid in Spain, which still trains Catholic priests for England. And you can see here that just on the left of the crucifix next to Weston, he's reading a book, we've got an exorcism taking place. And in fact, if you read the letters that are written on the book that he's reading, they are exorcisdo te immunde spiritus. I exorcise you, unclean spirit. So this portrait is very much portraying Weston as an exorcist. He is the leader of the Jesuit mission in the 1580s. And in 1585, he begins this enormous campaign of exorcism where he goes around in secret. It's remarkable that he could have done this in secret, given how much noise these demoniacs are making and how much attention they must have attracted. Goes around the houses of Catholic gentlemen in the Thames Valley, and demoniacs flock from all quarters, demanding to be exorcised by him and a team of other priests. And this becomes immensely problematic for the Church of England, because if Catholic priests are successfully exorcising people, if they are able to cast out the devil, then that casts shade on the Church of England, suggests that the Church of England is not the true Church of Christ, that it does not have the power to do as the apostles did and to cast out demons, and therefore the Catholic Church is the true church. And so two Anglican apologists get on the case One of them is Richard Bancroft, who at that time is Bishop of London, later Archbishop of Canterbury, and the other is Samuel Harsnet. And Samuel Harsnet writes a book called A Declaration of Popish Impostures, which is really all about Weston's exorcisms. But interestingly enough, because it's written quite a number of years later in 1603, it's targeting Darrell. So it's about Weston, but it's really about Darrell, if that makes any sense, because Darrell is also a target. In other words, the Church of England's higher echelons has turned against the Catholics. Well, we knew that was going to happen because the Church of England was set up in contradistinction to the Roman Catholic Church to begin with, but it's also turned against the hotter Protestants within its own ranks. It's turned against the Puritans. It's turned against the Puritan practice of exorcism. And Bancroft brings Darrell to trial, strips him of the ministry, and essentially forbids him from any form of ministry, and certainly forbids him from any more exorcism. Bancroft then gets on the case in a much more dramatic way. A revision at this time is taking place of the canons of the Church of England. The canons are the law that governs the procedures of the Church of England, and at this time the Church of England is still, even though it's gone through the Reformation, operating under the canon law of the old Catholic Church. And so what Bancroft decides to do is to revise this. Of course, he needs the permission of the king in order to do that. The king by this time is James I. And Bancroft wants to stamp out exorcism completely. James does not want a complete ban on exorcism. James I, if you remember, is the king who is also extremely interested in witchcraft and demonology. As King of Scotland, he had been very interested in witches, had written a book called The Demonology in 1597, which is all about witchcraft. And so James is certainly not a skeptic. He's not somebody who would be willing to doubt the power of the devil in the world. So James asks Bancroft to keep in some kind of bare recognition that exorcism might be possible. And so Canon 72 of the Church of England contains a prescription that exorcism can only be performed if the local bishop has issued a specific license to a specific person for a specific exorcism to take place. So it's much like, if you know anything about church buildings, a bit like a faculty in the modern Church of England, where it has to be very specific. You have to apply for it. You have to get all your ducks in a row, and it takes ages to get one. And if it's something particularly controversial, you probably won't get it anyway. And so this kind of license is actually never issued. Never in the entire history of the Church of England was one of these licenses ever issued. So effectively, exorcism has been banned. But having said that, although exorcism is banned in 1604, it also remains as part of the theology of the Church of England, because the canons do not deny the possibility of demonic possession, nor do they deny the possibility that exorcism might work. And in fact, they implicitly say that it could work if you've got one of these licenses that theoretically could be granted. And while these licenses were never issued in the Church of England, they were sometimes issued in the colonies. So we have an example, for example, in Barbados, where one of these licenses is issued under the authority of the governor of Barbados, who's effectively acting as a bishop, as happened in 17th century colonies. This is in 1634. So exorcism doesn't entirely cease to exist. There's also another loophole in the canons of 1604, because the canons of 1604 specifically ban exorcism of persons. They ban what John Darrell was doing. They ban the idea of people gathering together and praying and fasting to cast out a spirit. And they also implicitly ban the kind of Catholic exorcism that William Weston was doing as well. What they don't say anything about, what that canon says nothing about, is the other kind of exorcism that I mentioned right at the start. Laying a ghost, sorting out a haunted house, casting out a spirit from a place. And this is something which there's some evidence that this may have continued throughout the 17th and 18th centuries. And there's a lot of folklore to which this cartoon, for example, refers to, where a group of parsons would gather together in order to lay a ghost. And this goes back to the story of John Shawn. John Shawn, if you remember, he confines the devil in a boot. And there's a persistent belief in English folklore that if you get a bunch of holy parsons, they might be able to confine the devil in a boot, in a bottle, in a box. Then the ghost will often be thrown into a river or thrown into a mill pond or something. And one of the formula that's used is that the ghost has to be sent away to the Red Sea. And sometimes it's a ghost, and sometimes it's a boggart, which is a term from the north of England. It can have a vague meaning, either a ghost or some kind of evil spirit. And so it seems that there is something like this going on. And there are a few people who we have evidence that they actually did attempt this because they didn't feel themselves to be bound by the restrictions of Canon 72. So in this way, exorcism does survive, sort of, in England. How then does exorcism come back? Well, in 1852, the first spiritualist seance takes place in England. Spiritualism is a phenomenon which originates in North America. It then goes from North America to France, interestingly enough, not straight to England. And then it comes from France to England in the middle of the 19th century. And spiritualism is as much a spiritual movement as an esoteric occult movement, as a pseudoscience. There's a strong belief amongst spiritualists, a desire to prove the existence of the afterlife. A number of 19th century scientists are deeply interested in the claims of spiritualism. Perhaps the scientist who was interested in it most famously was Oliver Lodge. Other very, very famous people are interested in it, like Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, like Lord Halifax. There comes a point where spiritualism in English society is really quite mainstream. It's something which is of widespread interest amongst the elite, but also amongst all classes of society from the working class upwards. Not to say that it ever gained complete acceptance. That would be a complete misrepresentation. But certainly there's a point where it seems almost 50-50 that English society is divided on the claims of spiritualism. But what spiritualism does when it comes to exorcism is it brings back the idea of the reality of the spiritual world. In the 18th century, there was a great deal of skepticism, a great deal of cynicism that passes into the early part of the 19th century as well. A great deal of secularism, a lot of people losing any kind of real interest in the spiritual world or confidence that a spiritual world really exists. You get a deterioration of religious belief sometimes into something more like deism, just a belief in a sort of omniscient creator who is not really interested in what we're doing now. But spiritualism brings things really back to a ground level again. The idea that there might be these discarnate spirits that mediums can get into contact with and so forth. And for the church, this poses a problem. Does the church support spiritualism and embrace it as a new expression of spirituality? Or does the church condemn this as a new form of necromancy, an old form of evil magic that's reasserting itself in the modern world? And the Church of England and its clergy are entirely divided on this. It might seem strange today because when you speak to clergy today, they would almost universally condemn spiritualism as being something that Christians shouldn't engage in. But in fact, in 1939, the Church of England produced a report on spiritualism that said that spiritualism should be welcomed as an authentic expression of human spirituality within the fold of the Church of England. This report, luckily for the Church of England, World War II broke out the next day. And so the report was never published and it was suppressed by the Archbishop of Canterbury. But the Church of England came within a hair's breadth of actually accepting that spiritualism was okay. And it's interesting to speculate on how if the Second World War hadn't happened somehow, the Church of England might well have, spiritualism would have become part of the liturgy and practice of the Church of England, which would be rather remarkable, but it almost happened. But yes, spiritualism divides opinion, but it brings back this consciousness of the reality of the spiritual world. Another factor that brings back that consciousness is the Church of England's extensive involvement in colonial ministry. The Church of England is to some extent the spiritual arm of the British Empire. The British Empire is extending into Africa, into Asia, into all these places where belief in spirits and belief in the spiritual world is very real, very raw, very protean. And it's something which the missionaries struggle to handle because they have been brought up in English public schools where an excessive interest in spiritual matters is rather frowned upon. Certainly an interest in occult matters or in evil spirits and so forth is not something that's really discussed in your average English Victorian theological college. But suddenly they're being plunged into these colonial environments where everybody believes in spirits, where they are a cultural reality that is absolutely inescapable. And they come back to rural Sussex, and suddenly they have to deal with these experiences that they've had and process them. And really, there's a generation of Victorian clergy who become much more open to the idea that, well, maybe witchcraft is real. Maybe not in England, but yes, in Africa. Maybe evil spirits are real. And if they can be real in Africa, then, well, maybe they can be real here as well. And so gradually you get this greater acceptance of the reality of evil spirits, and therefore a greater openness towards the idea of exorcism. So how does exorcism come back in the Church of England? Well, it's all down to one man, and that man was Gilbert Shaw. Gilbert Shaw, when he was an undergraduate at Cambridge, had an unnerving encounter when one of the undergraduate societies that he belonged to invited a man called Aleister Crowley to come and speak to the group. And Aleister Crowley, this is before the First World War, and Aleister Crowley, you may well have heard of, was a notorious occultist, denounced by many for being a Satanist, and certainly was somebody who held the most extreme views of anybody in England at that time on what was permissible in the way of religious and spiritual experimentation. And clearly this really shocked Shaw, who was quite a religious young man, but not yet committed to a vocation in the priesthood or the Church of England. And it gave Shaw a lifelong terror of the dark powers that might oppose the spiritual life. He was also a mystic, so he was interested in spiritual advancement on the light side, if you like, and saw that there could be the possibility of attack from the dark side as well. And he becomes a student at Oxford later on. This is after the First World War, in order to complete his studies. And there he meets a group of like-minded young men. And at one stage, they attempt an exorcism of a ghost that had appeared in the quad of Magdalen College. On another occasion, they travel out to a nearby town, Eynsham, and they attempt some sort of exorcism there, although Shaw refused to ever talk about exactly what happened at Eynsham. But then he becomes rector of a small theological college up in Lincolnshire, at a place called Burle Marsh. And in 1926, Shaw is deep in meditation, and he becomes aware of what he thinks are Bolshevik magicians over in the Soviet Union, who are attempting to send bad vibes, essentially, over to England in order to prolong the general strike of 1926. So these are communist magicians who are sending evil spirits or evil vibes to prolong the general strike and disrupt the country. And what Shaw believes is that they're using ley lines. And this is just after Alfred Watkins has brought out a book called The Old Straight Track, which invents the idea of ley lines. Shaw was in fact the first person to give a spiritual interpretation to ley lines, which normally is associated with the 1960s, but Shaw was doing this decades earlier. And he comes to believe that an Anglo-Saxon tumulus in the village of Burle Marsh called Cock Hill, next to the church, which is the picture, is in fact one of the nodal points on the ley line which the Marxist magicians are using in order to transmit evil power across Britain. So if he can cut off that stream of evil power, then he will be able to save Britain from the general strike. And this all may seem very, very bizarre, but this is actually one of the first exorcisms to have any kind of publicity to take place in England since the Reformation. So he and a group of other priests go to Cock Hill and they exorcise the tumulus. So this is the beginning, really, of the revival of exorcism in the Church of England. And shortly thereafter, the general strike did indeed come to an end. So you can make up your own opinion as to whether Shaw was actually successful. Well, Shaw had a protege, a guy called Max Petitpierre. Petitpierre later takes the name of Robert. So he's also known as Robert Petitpierre because he becomes an Anglican monk. He is Shaw's sidekick, essentially, but eventually falls out with him. But Petitpierre and Shaw together become advisors to the bishops on the subject of exorcism. And one of the things that Shaw does is during the Second World War, he conducts a few exorcisms. In 1940, he performs what's probably the first exorcism of a person believed to be possessed, that had been performed in England by an Anglican priest since John Darrell's time, since the 16th century. And Shaw, because he's quite a respected figure, he eventually becomes an advisor to Lambeth Palace on occult matters. And so he advises them on how to deal with black magic and so forth in the 1950s. And in 1958, Shaw is asked to draft part of a bishop's report about the ministry of healing. And that bit about exorcism goes into the report on the Ministry of Healing. And it's the first time that exorcism is mentioned in an official Church of England report. But there are other exorcists around at that time as well. There's a guy called Donald Omond, perhaps most notorious for having attempted to exorcise the Loch Ness Monster. And a little photograph on the slide of Donald Omond attempting to exorcise the Loch Ness Monster, which you probably can't see because I'm hiding it, but that's him sitting in a boat reading the liturgy of exorcism and trying to exorcise Loch Ness. So some of these exorcists were quite eccentric, but the common factor that they have is that there's a renewed enthusiasm and interest in what was going on. However, the key moment takes place in 1969, and that's when General Synod, which has just recently been created as the governing body of the Church of England, decides to repeal most of the canons of 1604, including Canon 72 banning exorcism. So from that moment onwards, any priest is free, in theory, to do any exorcism that he chooses, and some really embrace this and decide this is the perfect moment, that I've always wanted to have a massive ministry of exorcism and have people in my church every Sunday being exorcised from Satan. Now is the time. Why not? Let's do it. And so there are some clergy who really go for this. But unfortunately, this has some very tragic consequences. In 1974, a terrible case occurs at a place called Ossett near Barnsley, when a man called Michael Taylor, who's undergoing a course of exorcism at a local church by an Anglican priest, goes home, murders his wife in the most horrific way imaginable, and kills the dog as well. And he is incarcerated in Broadmoor for the rest of his life as a result of this. But it's a horrific case because it causes a great deal of controversy for the Church of England. Why were the bishops allowing this kind of behavior on the part of their priests? Why were they allowing a priest to perform an exorcism so traumatizing that it triggered mental illness in this man that caused him to commit the most horrific acts? Clearly, the church was in some way responsible. And some within the church really doubled down and said, well, no, the fact that he did this terrible thing just proves that he really was possessed and that evil is real, and therefore we need more exorcisms. But there are others who say, well, actually, the church has gone too far. We need to rethink our approach completely. And the man on the left is Geoffrey Lamp, who was the Regius Professor of Divinity at Cambridge at this time. And Lamp goes through a campaign in 1974, 1975, where he writes to all the bishops asking them to back a campaign to end exorcism in the Church of England, to end it completely, to effectively go back to the situation that was established in 1604, because it's simply too dangerous for the Church of England to be involved in that. Well, some of the bishops do back Lamp's campaign, but ultimately the Archbishop of Canterbury, Donald Coggan, decides that exorcism will continue. And Coggan adopts a pretty cunning plan in order to bring about this change. So what he decides to do is, during the debates of the General Synod in July 1975, he decides that he will make an informal statement in which he sets forth some guidelines, setting out what he thinks should be the way that exorcism is performed. Now, officially, this doesn't really have much status, but unofficially, of course, he's the Archbishop of Canterbury, he's talking in General Synod. So from the point of view of informal authority, it has a great deal. But what he does not do, he does not put forward a new canon. If he'd put forward a new canon, it would have had to go through Parliament. That means a parliamentary debate on the subject of exorcism and demonic possession. And you can imagine why the Church of England would not have wanted such a thing. Can you imagine the headlines that that would have generated, especially in the 1970s? So that does not happen. But what he does is, because he's left it something which is not governed by canon, it's down to individual bishops. Individual bishops have the authority to determine how exorcism is done within their diocese. And essentially that leads to the situation that we have in the Church of England today. So the Church of England today has 42 dioceses. Each one of those dioceses has an exorcist. In the 1980s, their title was changed because it was believed that exorcist was a bit too emotive a term. So they are now known as deliverance ministers. So there are deliverance ministers in every one of those dioceses, who is a priest appointed by the bishop within that diocese, given specific training in how to conduct an exorcism. I've been involved in giving some of that training, just giving them a historical background for some of those deliverance ministers. And they are then entrusted with dealing with anyone who comes to the church asking for exorcism. Now, in most cases, it's simply somebody asking for their house to be blessed because something went bump in the night. The idea of people coming to the church because they believe they're possessed by the devil is pretty rare. But there are exorcists in the Church of England. A large number of exorcisms of one sort or another, depending how you define them, are performed every year. The Roman Catholic Church also has exorcists, but it's more likely that only Catholics would approach the Roman Catholic Church, whereas the Church of England, because it's the national church, because it's the established church, a lot of people will come to that even if they're not regular churchgoers or what identify as Church of England themselves. There are also not very many Roman Catholic exorcists in the country, partly because the Roman Catholic Church doesn't really have the resources in order to train them to the level that's required. So the Catholic exorcists are a bit more rare. And of course, there are lots of freelance exorcists, various occultists, and people who will claim to have special powers, and psychics, and people who will offer to cleanse your house or whatever. So there's also a kind of a private market, if you like, of these people with whom the official exorcists of the church have to compete. But it is certainly very much a feature of life in the church today, even if it is something which isn't very much talked about. It is certainly there. But anyway, I'm going to conclude there. And I'm very happy, if we've got any time left, to take any questions that you might have, because there are lots of areas that I'm sure I haven't covered that you might well be interested in. But thank you.
Francis, thank you so much for your lecture today. That's been fantastic. And I think that's been a real nice conclusion to our October series of lectures exploring particularly spooky or some more folklore origins and stories connected to church. So thank you very much for your time today. So we have got time for some questions. And so everyone, if you've got questions for Dr. Francis Young, please do comment away on Facebook and let us know what those questions are, and I will try my best to put them to Francis now. But everyone, we put on lectures every single week. So if you're joining us for the very first time, warm welcome to you all. Please do let us know if this is your first time. I hope you've enjoyed this lecture. But you can catch up on all of our previous recordings, all of our lectures, completely free of charge. You can catch up on them on Facebook or on YouTube. Now in November, there'll be a really exciting announcement made. I'm just working on a couple of things, but I keep telling you week after week, there's some news coming. It'll be coming to you in November, so stay tuned because it will have an impact on the lectures, but in a good way. So keep tuned for that. But if you've enjoyed these lectures and if you'd like to see us continue more, I'm booking now dates for 2021. Please do consider becoming a member of the Trust or donating to support our work. As you can see, I'm inside the glorious church there of St. Nicholas, Withensea, where we're completing our vesting repairs and getting ready to hand this church back to the community as a heritage attraction. It's no longer used for regular worship, although it remains consecrated, and we do hope that there'll be carol services, Easter services that still take place here. But this is going to have so much use and be give back to the local community to use how they want to. So there's a couple of ways you can support our work. You can donate through our website, which is at visitchurches.org.uk. You can text donate. If you've got your mobile phone with you, you can text CCT to 70331, and that will give us a gift of £5. Or you can become a member of the Trust. Now, membership starts from just £3.50 a month, and it's a really fantastic way of supporting us at the Trust. If you sign up by direct debit, and if you use the offer code LECTURE, and that's the word lecture in capitals, you'll be sent a free copy of Dr. Richard Stent's book, Decoding the Secret Language of Christianity's Sacred Churches and Cathedrals. Now, I don't have a copy to hand with me, but if you've already received your copy, do let us know what you think of that book. But we're going to dive into some questions now. Now, Francis, I'm quite interested because earlier on you talked about, particularly in medieval England, if you have a particular ailment, you might go to the shrine of a saint. Now, I know in Chiltern in Suffolk, so our home county, there is a really interesting stained glass window, 15th century, to Saint Apollonia and Saint Michael. Now, obviously, Saint Apollonia is one of those 3rd century Virgin Martyrs. For people who don't know who she is, she church folklore or a legend has it that she was tortured and by having all of her teeth removed or crushed. And so there's this really fascinating depiction of her in our church in Chiltern, where she's there holding this pick, and it's got this molar in this pick that she's holding. But directly opposite her is Saint Michael vanquishing the devil. Now, do we find this imagery common in churches? And would people go to the parish church if they thought they may be under some kind of demonic attack?
That's really interesting that you've got Saint Apollonia with St Michael, because yes, I mean St Michael is worth mentioning really as an exorcist saint, in the sense that he is connected with the vanquishing of Satan. So yeah, people historically have prayed to St Michael for deliverance, and yeah, you find representations of St Michael in many churches. Often you'll find them in the spandrels, those corner areas of a pointed arch, where you've got St Michael slaying the dragon. Maybe that's quite common in East Anglia, but yeah, you've got places like St Michael's Mount. You've got the tower in Glastonbury dedicated to St Michael. You've got those famous sites that are on high places where St Michael is venerated, and yeah, some of the people who came on pilgrimage to those places would have been seeking deliverance from the devil. And Saint Apollonia, you mentioned, with the connection with teeth, she was invoked against toothache, but toothache was believed by medieval people to be the result of minor demons getting inside your teeth. So in that sense, what Saint Apollonia was doing was driving away those minor demons. Yeah, so that's an interesting example where you've got, you know, the slayer of Satan, the sort of the one brought in for the heavy work, but you've also got Saint Apollonia to deal with some of those smaller, more troublesome little demons.
And sorry about the noise, everyone. The workmen are busy away, but it's also interesting about St Michael's. Obviously, if you go to Coventry, there's that really famous bronze sculpture of him, you know, from the 1960s, of them vanquishing Satan. But is there a particular role in England where not only saints are invoked, but do we see other heavenly beings such as angels? Do we see they have a particular role in English exorcism versus continental Roman Catholic exorcisms?
Well, you're absolutely right that the angels do continue to have a position within English Protestantism after the saints have gone. And that's to do with the fact that the Reformation is opposed to images, and it's opposed to the intercession of the saints. But there is a loophole for angels because of the Old Testament saying that the Ark of the Covenant had cherubs portrayed on it, and therefore if that's okay for the Old Testament when they were against idolatry, it's also okay for the Protestant church. So yeah, there would have been images of angels in some churches that continued to survive throughout that Reformation period. Whether they had any role, whether they had any significance in exorcism is something that we just don't know, but it's an interesting avenue to explore maybe.
So for anyone watching here, think of doing a PhD in exorcism, that's something you might want to look at there. We've had a comment come in, and I think it's quite a nice one, so I'm just going to share it with you. But thank you for a very insightful lecture. The early medieval text of baptism certainly had prayers for exorcism over the water. In Britain and Ireland, there had been a long tradition of pagan worship at rivers and streams over a period of time. These prayers are referred to as blessings rather than exorcisms. Are they in essence really the same thing, do you think, thus invoking the presence of grace? Meaning that the expulsion of that is then regarded as evil?
That's a really interesting question. Yeah, the relationship between exorcism and blessing, from a liturgical and a theological point of view, when you look at the structure of these prayers, they are actually a double event. So an exorcism takes place first, followed by a blessing. So holy water we think of as being blessed water, but it's actually exorcised as well as blessed water. So the theory behind this is essentially to do with the fall. So to do with the belief that when Adam and Eve fell, not only humanity, but the entirety of nature was somehow corrupted by sin. And therefore, if you're going to use something natural like water or salt within the worship of God, within the service of the church, it needs to be exorcised first and then blessed. But the person asking the question also raised the interesting question of whether this is to do with the fact that bodies of water were associated in paganism with worship. And I think this is a really interesting question for England, where you have these specific rites in Anglo-Saxon pontificals that are unique to England, where a body of water is blessed so that someone can undergo a judicial ordeal in it. And that's a little bit like what they used to do with witches, where you'd get swum. But in the Anglo-Saxon period, it wasn't just witches, it could be anybody who'd said that, you know, they were innocent, would be thrown in the water and see whether they float. And the body of water had to be exorcised. And I wonder whether that is in some way connected to the fact that there was this earlier belief in gods living in bodies of water, which were then interpreted as demons by the Christians, and therefore an exorcism needed to take place. So yeah, there are links there with certainly the response to pre-Christian beliefs, but also the nature of that rite as both an exorcism and a blessing.
Now, for those of you who are big fans of horror films, this question will probably ring a few bells with you. But obviously, there's quite a few horror films where the famous American demonologist Ed and Lorraine Warren are shown working with the Roman Catholic Church. Is it the case in England that demonologists did work with the church, and do they still work with the Church of England?
Well, demonology plays a very important role in exorcism, because if you don't have some kind of theoretical idea of what you're doing as an exorcist, then it's unclear why you would want to do it in the first place. So there's always an element of practical demonology that's involved in exorcism. And in fact, when you look at the 18th century and the 19th century, when there weren't really any exorcisms happening, there was still demonological writing that was taking place. So in other words, it's the theoretical side, even if the practical side was not taking place. And yes, I mean, you know, deliverance ministers today, they are expected to have some kind of awareness of the latest theological thinking with regard to demonology. And of course, that is something which is very controversial about, you know, exactly what things you accept as being real. You know, when people describe something to you, to what extent are you going to give that credence, or to what extent are you going to tell them, well, actually, no, it's like this? And so, yeah, there is a lot of controversy there about what the demonology of the Church of England should be. And of course, it doesn't really have any official demonology. But yeah, the kind of the pre-existing assumptions that an exorcist has about the nature of evil and about the nature of evil spirits will completely inform what they do when they actually come to perform that exorcism. So there are some deliverance ministers today who are quite skeptical, and therefore their default mode would simply be to offer a few prayers or a little bit of house blessing. And there are others who are less skeptical, and their default mode would be to kind of go on the offensive against, you know, dark powers that might be there. So, you know, it depends what your initial assumptions are, how you're going to act as an exorcist.
Thank you, Francis. And I think another question that's quite interesting is, obviously we've, for those of you who are joining us for the first time, we've done a couple of lectures now about witchcraft. And someone's asked a question here, but was there an impact, or was there any effect in England on the repeal of the 1951 repeal of Witchcraft Act? Did it have any impact, if any?
Yeah, well, the 1951 repeal of the Witchcraft Act effectively made it legal to say that you were a witch. You had a pre-existing Witchcraft Act, the 1735 Witchcraft Act, which is, in a way, it's a bit of a misnomer. It's called the Witchcraft Act, but really it was about prohibiting anyone from pretending to supernatural powers. So if you said that you were a witch, you could be put on trial for trying to deceive people into believing that you had supernatural power. It wasn't really an act that was there in order to prosecute witchcraft, because the act specifically denied that such a thing as witchcraft existed. Whereas what that 1951 Act does, it removes that restriction, which means that, for one thing, Gerald Gardner is able to go on TV and say, I am a witch, I have founded a coven, you know, and witchcraft is real and is out there. Whereas technically he could have been prosecuted before 1951 for doing that. In terms of the effect on exorcism, I think that it simply makes exorcists a bit more paranoid, because there are lots of people now running around saying I'm a witch, and that freaks a lot of people out, and they therefore think, well, actually this means the devil is back, that, you know, these dark powers have been unleashed and we need more exorcists. And I think that one thing that you see in the 1960s and 70s is this growth of paranoia, which is almost a mirror to the growth of the occult revival of those decades, where there's a great deal of interest in the occult, there's a great deal of interest in alternative spiritualities and new religious movements, including neo-paganism. And the church often reacts in quite a paranoid and hysterical way to that. And so I think some of the growth of exorcism can be attributed to the effects of the 1951 Fraudulent Mediums Act, which repeals that ban on saying that you were a witch.
Thank you for that answer there, Francis. And I've only got time, I'm afraid, everyone, for a couple more questions, but I think it was quite interesting. So we talked about baptism, and some people may not realize that in the liturgy of baptism, there is a rite of exorcism. Is that still the case? Because someone commented that isn't it the case that the Church of England removed the exorcism rite from the baptism liturgy?
It came back in 1978 in the Alternative Service Book, and it was then carried over into into common worship at the turn of the millennium. So in the Book of Common Prayer, there is no exorcism of any kind. So that, of course, is still a legal liturgy, but most babies will be baptized according to the rite in common worship. So there is a very kind of light and slightly ambiguous exorcism in there. But yes, if you listen out for it, there is essentially a prayer against the powers of darkness, but it's couched more as a prayer. It's not couched as a direct address to Satan to depart. So it's certainly not anything as full-blooded as what you find in the 1549 prayer book, or indeed what you find in the Roman Catholic liturgy today.
And I think another one that's quite interesting here is we've talked obviously a lot about particularly sort of if you've got toothache, it could be evil forces and all that. Was there any, particularly in England, any understanding that these were, organized for? We often hear sometimes the forces of evil or forces of darkness. Is there any understanding sort of in English exorcism that these are this is an organized sort of attack on humanity orchestrated by the devil, or is it actually not seen as sort of some great planned evil attack underway?
Traditionally, no, it's not seen as organized. I mean, in English tradition, for example, witchcraft is a solitary activity. It's just something which, bad people will make a pact with the devil in order to harm their neighbors. That's the way it's thought of in the early modern period. Similarly, you'll find that these kind of ghost-laying parsons will just be dealing with one particular evil individual who's decided to hang around and trouble people. In Scotland, on the other hand, it's completely different. In Scotland, there is a very strong belief in Scottish tradition in covens of witches who are trying to undermine the country and wreck everything. But that never really took hold in England. And I think it's only really only really in the 1970s that you get this idea coming across from US culture, coming across from cinema, from popular culture, of the idea of organized bands of Satanism and people in satanic societies and things like that. But that's very much a modern thing. That's not something that you find in English folk tradition at all. So yeah, it's not part of English folklore, not part of English tradition.
I think final question is that, do you have a particular historical story about exorcism that you think in terms of folklore is actually really quite interesting?
Well, there are so many. I mean, I suppose one of the most famous is the exorcism of Dorothy Dinglet. And this occurs in 1664, when there's this parson called Mr. Rudd, and he is, Ruddle, not Rudd. That's a different one entirely. John Ruddle, and this is in Cornwall, so right in the western edge of Cornwall. And he encounters a case where a schoolboy has been on his way to school, and every day he's troubled by the ghost of a woman who's recently died called Dorothy Dinglet. And she'll just basically come into the meadow that he's crossing on his way to school and annoy him and sort of, do whatever it is that ghosts do in order to make your life unpleasant. And he becomes scared and doesn't want to cross this meadow. And so John Ruddle decides that he's going to go down there and have it out with the ghost of Dorothy Dinglet. And so he does, and essentially just has a conversation with her, asks her why she's hanging around, and tells her to go. And he uses his authority as a priest in order to banish her. But it's all done quite informally. But what's interesting about the story is that when in the retelling, in various literary forms, like with the way that Daniel Defoe retells it, for example, it becomes very elaborate, and John Ruddle becomes a magician, and he brings all his ritual paraphernalia and his wand and draws the magic circle and conjures the ghost to appear and all that. Whereas in fact, if you read Ruddle's own account of what happened, he basically just goes down there and has a chat with her and tells her to go. And it just shows you how folklore sometimes can elaborate things beyond what really happened or what the participants themselves thought really happened.
Thank you, Francis, for sharing that with us. And everyone, thank you so much for your questions. I'm sorry I've not had time to ask all of them, but I will do my best to try and get some answers for those questions that I haven't had time to ask. But as I said, if this is your first time joining us today, I hope you've enjoyed it. Please do let us know where you're watching from and if you've had a good and positive experience. I hope you are able to join us for future lunchtime lectures. Now, there is a lecture taking place next week and several weeks after that. I've got lectures booked right in now until 2022. I haven't yet put them on Facebook. I will get them advertised hopefully this evening from my hotel where I'm staying in Hull later on tonight. So do keep an eye out, and we'll see you next Thursday for another lunchtime lecture. But as always, if you've got ideas for future topics you'd like us to explore, any particular lectures you'd like us to approach, please do comment away, or you can email me personally at digital@thecct.org.uk. And it's been great because already people have been emailing me, and I'm really excited because I've been able to follow up on some of those suggestions and get lectures booked in for next year on suggestions sent to me. So thank you so much for you've sent suggestions in with recommendations. As I said, if you've enjoyed these lectures, please do consider supporting our really important work of caring for, at the moment, 356 historic redundant churches across the country. As I said, I'm inside today in one of our churches, and if you join me, keep an eye, look out on Facebook tomorrow, because I'll be doing a live stream with our chief executive where we'll talk about some of the really important work we've done here, but also about some of the plans that we've got going forward regarding conservation at some other churches. This week we've had a really exciting announcement we made regarding Heritage Stimulus Fund, where we've been generously awarded grants from DCMS and Historic England to carry out urgent conservation and repair work at 13 historic churches. So do join us tomorrow, where we'll be talking to you a bit more about some of the conservation work that we're going to be doing. But once again, thank you so much everyone for joining us, and thank you to Dr. Francis Young for taking the time once again to do another Thursday lunchtime lecture with us. I hope everyone has a great weekend, and we look forward to seeing you again at a future lunchtime lecture.